Hi, good morning, everyone. And let's start off with today's session, which is looking at, learning outcome 3 for research project. Now, in this learning outcome 3 for research project, today we are looking at, covering the learning outcome. It says be able to evaluate the research outcomes. Excuse me. This particular learning outcome has 3 different assessment criteria. One, which is saying 3.1, it says use appropriate research evaluation techniques. So we look at what are research evaluation techniques. And when we talk about these techniques, we've touched on them briefly in some of the other sessions, broadly to say that when we talk about research evaluation methods or techniques, they tend to be things like how are you going to go about doing your research, whether it's going to be primary or secondary. And when we talk about these methods, primary, secondary, or tertiary, we are going to be looking at what are the methods through which you go about collecting data. So when we talk about research onion, we talk about research evaluation techniques. We are looking at essentially, discussing things which are related to qualitative and quantitative side of research. We're going to be looking at understanding, what could be the the various ways or methods through which you go about, collecting research data. And then towards the end, in the second part, we are looking at interpreting and analyzing the results of the, data that you've collected, and then make further recommendations or justify what could be the future areas of research when we go about, concluding our report. So essentially, when we talk about, say, research methods or research evaluation techniques, we're going to be looking at interpreting and analyzing data, and then how to present your data, and talk about essentially recommendations which will be then made for any future areas of research that we would want to do. So let's look at diving into this particular learning outcome today to continue our discussion. There's a fair bit of indicative content which is given. So when we talk about evaluation of outcomes, it is looking at triangulating, the details which have been formulated initially in the research specification, which is your aims and objectives of research, the research questions that we look at, and then the literature review or the existing review of literature that we carry out, which is the existing data or availability of existing data which is in the published domain for the research or closely related to your research that you're carrying out, needs to be incorporated along with your findings. And that triangulation essentially of data of your aims and objectives, your review of the literature, and your findings of what you collected, by carrying out a set of activities tends to be dictating and tends to give you the outcomes, which is the evaluation of your outcomes. And then we'll be looking at, obviously making recommendations. Every research project that we do requires us to make recommendations for future research. And this tends to be related to, giving suitable guidelines to researchers or maybe, fellow researchers. When you publish your research report, you would have a section in that which will clearly go about mentioning that, if somebody was to take up your research and decide to do further activity or further analysis on it, what could be the possible areas? So you give out some guidelines, what could be the possible outcomes or areas that would be good for them to carry out further activities. Sometimes it does happen that when you do your research, you are there are constraints which are essentially encountered, and these constraints could be financial constraints, administrative constraints, operational constraints. It could be non-availability of participants, the sample size in terms of data that you wanted to collect the answers or the feedback from, and then in some cases complications which can arise primarily of the nature of the data which is collected, and some part of the data which cannot be anonymized, or participants do not allow that data to be published. Then in those cases, these tend to be constraints, and they would inform future researchers who would like to carry out more activities or elaborate on your research which you have presented as a report. Then these constraints would act as guidelines, and these constraints are then put forward as recommendations for areas of future research. And that is what we are going to look at in this particular learning outcome. Now, this learning outcome, as you can see, it says be able to. So practically speaking, we are going to be at some stage looking at a research project. And I mentioned to you that there are in the research proposal template, if I just briefly bring that up on the screen, you would have seen that, this particular research template that I've shared with you. I have given you two particular websites, which basically allow you to pick up a research topic and a research report of your interest, a topic that is of interest to you. And using that particular topic, you're going to be downloading that report and then using that report to create a research project specification. And this particular research report that you're going to pick out is also going to be submitted along with your research project, because we are looking at carrying out a secondary research or desk-based research, in which you are going to be looking at analyzing a research report, collecting data, summarizing it, paraphrasing it, and condensing it to write a summary of that in about 4,500 words, 4,500 words, essentially, to present the assignment, which is going to be related to research project. So in this case, when we talk about be able to and analyze and interpret results, what that report will be helpful for you to do is basically pick out tables, charts, graphs, and the main points of conclusion which have been drawn up by undertaking that research activity by the researcher in the report are going to be presented in your assignment as an evidence, and that would fulfill some of the criteria, assessment criteria for this particular learning outcome. And then we are going to be looking at obviously picking out recommendations and areas which are going to be something that you're going to put your spin on it, and then present them for the purposes of, present them as a report that you're going to present, from your perspective, to meet this particular criteria for the research project. Now, if we go across into a couple of slides, there's not many very slides to be able to, obviously take you through today, but we are going to look at a few key questions in terms of understanding some of the, particular interests with regards to when we talk about, bits and pieces which are part and parcel of this, learning outcome. So if we talk about the keyword or terminology called research outcomes. Now, what does research outcomes essentially mean? Research outcomes means, what is going to be the anticipated result or conclusions that you're going to arrive at after carrying out the series of activities that you have planned to do in your research. Now, these series of activities are obviously defined in your research project specification using what is called a Gantt chart. So if you recall some of the bits that I had explained, to some of you guys earlier, and I had explained the Gantt chart, I think the example which I had shared, if you look at with regards to some of the activities that you carry out, if I just put this up in a slide here just for the purposes of showing. So when we talk about, the purposes of, looking at carrying out a research, you normally come up and draw what is called a timeline. And this timeline essentially, helps you understand, what would be the series of activities that you're going to carry out from the purpose of, carrying out your research. So in this case, if I look at, a timeline, and this timeline, if I put it this way, when you look at drawing this particular timeline, what you are looking at doing is defining a series of activities that you're going to be carrying out. And these series of activities that you're going to carry out are going to dictate, the outcomes of your research. Because, for example, in the first week, you might decide and you might carry out, selecting, you might spend a week or so in terms of selecting the topic. And then, when you look at selecting the particular topic, in this case, you are looking at, doing, after that, once you've selected the topic, you're looking at doing a literature review, in terms of your project. And then once you have done the literature review, you are going to go to the next activity. And that next activity is going to be looking at identification of your research methods, which is basically your research methodology. You'll spend 2 to 3 weeks, in terms of collecting data, because obviously you have to sometimes give times to participants to be able to respond to your questionnaire and respond to your data requests. And in those cases, you spend that time in terms of, collecting the data. And then once you've had the data, you start at some stage doing data analysis. And this data analysis that you start to do might take a couple of weeks. You might need to use a software. And this data analysis that you do allows you to then compile the results of your, research, which has been, collected. And then you start to interpret simultaneously. As you start to interpret data, you start interpreting your findings. And then towards the end, what you will look at doing is basically start drawing some conclusions along with the findings which you are getting. And then at some stage, you are going to submit your project or publish your project work. And that essentially is going to be what we term as what is called the Gantt chart. Now, a Gantt chart primarily, tends to be a time scale, essentially of your research project. So this is what I would suggest, that when we talk about research outcomes and the conclusions that we're going to draw, the data that we're going to collect, analyze it, interpret it, and when we present it, is going to be related to covering what are called the research outcomes. Now, research outcomes can come from, when you carry out these series of activities, and they tend to come from, things like product processes, any experimentations that you have carried out, and the supporting data that you have collected through observation. Now, an example of outcomes typically tend to be, outcomes can also be defined as endpoints or events. And when you carry out these series of events or, series of activities, at the end of it, you get some sort of an outcome. And they tend to be what are basically then observed, and the interpretation of those outcomes is done to come out with what is called meaningful results for your research. Now, this brings us nicely into understanding, and a typical example that I would say in terms of research outcomes is, if you look at again the COVID vaccine, for which there was research done, extensive research done for a period of 18 months, after which the vaccine was approved by various different organizations, like in the UK MHRA, in the US FDA, and things like that. A typical example of research outcomes could be some sort of clinical trial, some sort of results which have come out of those clinical trials, and it either approves the product or disapproves the product, and the filing of that with FDA or MHRA, which is the regulatory authority in the UK, then approves that for the purposes of mass circulation in the population. So these could be favorable research outcomes, because that led to the development of the Pfizer Moderna vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And this was a favorable outcome in terms of collection of data, analyzing of data, and all the other bits or processes which were done in the middle to be able to test the vaccine and bring out a vaccine which is credible and is, provided us a solution to bring the pandemic under control. Now, what are research results? These are results which are technical results, scientific results, which are basically coming out of the experimentation that you have done and the series of activities that you've carried out, and they tend to then relate to either inventions, ideas, designs, some sort of algorithms or programs that have been run or executed in order to come out with those results, which then are compiled as a report towards the end of your research. Now, let's look at one or two quick other things with regards to understanding the assessment criteria that we are covering. Now, when we talk about the first one, it talks about use appropriate research evaluation techniques. So when we talk about research evaluation techniques in general, when we generally say, what are appropriate research evaluation techniques. Now, these research appropriate, evaluation techniques, they tend to be methods which are going to be quite popular. They're going to be used, during the course of your research activity or the series of events that you undertake to conclude your project. They would include measurements. They would include some sort of, you'll do some inputs in terms of certain activities. It'll bring out some outputs, and those outputs are going to be either observed or, essentially looked at from a point of view of, using them for the purposes of, let's say, at some stage, coming out with conclusions. So the most common methods tend to be, methods which help you analyze data. And these methods which help you analyze the collected data are termed as what are called research evaluation methods or techniques. Now, evaluation generally tends to be a set of research methods and associated methodologies, which could be, some sort of a strategy, and they are basically carried out for a very distinctive purpose, so that your report and your results typically which come out are going to be of value. Now, when we talk about these research evaluation techniques and methods, they basically focus on 4 different things. First one is they look at focusing on certain foundation issues, which tend to be related to the rationale of your result, of your research, aims and objectives that you've set, and then will also relate it to the theoretical aspect of it in terms of, why is the reason, or what are the reasons why you're carrying out this particular research. The second aspect of it tends to be looking at examining, vast amounts of data, which is what is covered under the review of literature. And this tends to inform some of the possible outcomes which are going to be uncovered when these series of activities are carried out. The third tends to be, looking at addressing qualitative methods, and this includes, things like case studies, responses, any sort of evaluation or participation which is done on the basis of, collection of data, which can be done on the basis of participation from, various people who will contribute to participating in surveys, questionnaires, focus group discussions. And then you're going to be looking at the last aspect of it, which is you're looking at analyzing, interpreting this particular data which has been collected, reviews, questionnaires, which have been collected, and then you're going to try and draw out some meaningful conclusions with regards to, the result itself. So this is what basically informs, what is called the result evaluation techniques. Now, all market research methods involve collecting and analyzing data, making decisions. We need to look at the validity of that information, whether that information is, sound, accurate, and factual, and can you draw meaningful inferences from it, from a point of view of your research activities that you're carrying out. So when we talk about evaluation methods or techniques, some of them are quite popular because they tend to be more popular with researchers, because they are easy to understand. The data points which are collected are easy to analyze and interpret, but some of them tend to be more complex, because in those cases you're looking at discussing and dealing with different kinds of variables which require different evaluation and measurement methods, and in those cases they tend to be different techniques. But in general, when the word evaluation technique comes to you, so we should look at 2 of these types when we talk about, and they tend to be these 2 techniques, if I put it this way: quantitative and qualitative. They are broadly classified into these 2 types. So if somebody is to ask you what is evaluation techniques, they are quantitative and qualitative type. Quantitative techniques tend to be, for example, things like how many, who is involved, what are the outcomes that we are going to uncover, and then also look at, say, for example, at what price are we getting these outcomes? And this will be more related to surveys, questionnaires, and polls. So if I have to put it this way, and if I have to talk about quantitative methods, and if I put this is, then the outcome of quantitative research methods is to answer questions which are going to be things like anything which is tangible to measure, things like how many, who is involved, and what are the outcomes, or at what price or time it is at which this data is being collected. And the best way to collect quantitative data that we can get from participants is generally through these three or four different types of techniques, and they tend to be, surveys, questionnaires, and polls. Now, surveys are used to gather opinions, feedbacks. It could be ideas that we are looking at some point in time. You can do these surveys through the online route now. You can look at sending across some of these as questionnaires, and then there is a bit of a survey logic behind these questionnaires and polls and surveys that we send out, because we use different kind of scales. For example, things like branching, quotas, change surveys, looping, Likert scale, and they tend to inform how you're going to be looking at and collecting and interpreting the data which is coming out of these particular questionnaires. Now, quantitative data methods, or when I talk about research techniques, basically measure the depth and breadth of the initiative. For example, it will tell you exactly how many people participated. It'll tell you how many people enrolled, and then it'll also tell you then how much of data was collected before and after the participant actually enrolled in the research. So, for example, if I was to analyze this we've just gone through the admission session in universities for September, October, and if I was to look at utilizing quantitative methods or as techniques to analyze, what were the number of admissions finalized by universities for the September, October session, then I'll be using the quantitative methods here, because I will clearly know how many applicants applied to the university, how many places were available, how many people were or students were offered these places, and how many finally accepted these places to start the university or their choice of course in the university in the September, October session. So quantitative data collected will, if I use the quantitative data technique here, it will allow me to analyze the data collected and come out with meaningful inferences, which are going to be related to answering questions like how many, who were involved, what were the possible outcomes, and how many, say in this case, the students joined. Now, the accuracy of quantitative data is generally, of the research depends on the number in terms of population size, the ease of analysis, and their consistency. That means how many have completed the questionnaires in full, how many have provided answers to all the questions or survey questions which have been given. And if in some cases you would feel that you would see that the questionnaires have not been answered in full, some of them have multiple answers, or some of them have been left out and remain unanswered, then in those cases what you will generally see is that this particular method fails, because the questions have the data which is to be collected from the questions which have been served cannot be accurately analyzed. And in some cases, if the questions themselves have not been framed well, then or framed correctly to get the desired results, and not being distributed to the right participants, can lead to skewed data being collected as far as the research is concerned. So in this case, it may have a downfall if the questions are not, presented or framed properly, and the participants to which the questionnaires need to be distributed, the target audience, has not been selected properly, then it can lead to skewed results. Now, on the other hand, when we talk about quantitative methods, or qualitative methods, essentially, here we are going to be focused on looking at methods which obviously cannot solve the problem, but they are going to tell you measures which are going to be intangible values. So qualitative gives you intangible values, quantitative gives you tangible values because it is related to numbers. And here, qualitative method or techniques typically tend to answer questions like, what is the value added, or how satisfied are you with the service? How likely are you to recommend us or to your friends? And how will it help us improve the experience? So as you see, the questions are more open-ended. They are more dependent on getting participatory response from people to whom the questions or this questionnaires are being served. So in this case, the qualitative methods use data like observations, interviews, case studies, and focus groups to be able to collect data. So that would be the essential difference if I would look at when I say talking about, qualitative and quantitative research techniques, or basically research techniques, and they tend to be of two types, and they would be either quantitative or qualitative. Now, when we talk about, obviously, data which is collected from observations, interviews, case studies, and focus groups. Here, you're going to be looking at examining that interview or that, say, observation. You're going to be looking at comparing and contrasting, and then looking at understanding and trying to come out with a pattern or a theme, which is what will predict the outcome of the research. So in this case, you are more focused on the identification of what the overarching theme will be or is emerging, how the data can be clustered, similar data can be clustered together, and then you're trying to make sense by reducing the points to bare minimum to come out with some meaningful conclusions. So when we talk about interviews here, interviews can be structured, they can be conducted, with one-on-one or on one-in-many under controlled conditions, and they will tend to have what is called the open-ended questions, things like what is the value added, how satisfied are you with the service, how likely are you to recommend. So as you can see, these are open-ended questionnaires, and they tend to be more based on person's perception and motivation when we talk about collecting data through this particular method. Now, the strength of this method is that generally when you do group discussions, you do observations, you do interviews, you're able to provide ideas and stimulate your participants to be able to participate more and fully within discussions, which tend to also help you uncover more data points that can be cross-question, like things like, why do you think it is that, or how do you think it will be better, or what can make these things much more let's say attractive to the customers. So you're able to counter question and also look at jogging memories in terms, let's put it this way, or stimulating memories of the participants to cascade topics which are being discussed in the context of your research. Obviously, there are limitations for this in terms of a research technique. So limitations for the qualitative research techniques tend to be that they are more subjective. The data which is collected is more subjective. It is more time consuming to analyze the data, because you are looking at coming out with some overarching themes, and you're trying to cluster similar data points across. And sometimes if there are diverse if there are lots of different types of participants which let's put it this way, help contribute to collecting and providing a lot of diverse data points, then analyzing and interpreting of the data to be able to come out with, say, some sort of a conclusion or a meaningful conclusion for your research tends to be a bit more difficult. So in those cases, we are looking at this as a limitation of, let's put it this way, the qualitative, techniques or research techniques. Now, any questions on this so far? So in the first assessment criteria, when it talks about use appropriate research evaluation techniques, you have to literally decide how you're going to go about carrying your research, whether it's going to be qualitative data, quantitative data, or quantitative data. And then you are going to be looking at taking into account how you would go about collecting by using some of the instruments, collecting data by using some of the instruments which are available when you choose a particular method for research. Quantitative means numerical or data related, and they will normally go across and come across from, surveys, questionnaires, polls. And when you talk about qualitative, it is going to be more of observations, interviews, case studies, and focus groups that you conduct in order to, get hold of let's say, data which is required for your research. Now, the second assessment criteria is interpret and analyze results in terms of original research specification. So when we talk about interpreting and analyzing, results, this is going to be looking at basically measurement of your data, coming out with meaningful conclusions from the data which has been collected. Now, whether it's quantitative, which is using statistical techniques, wherein you're looking at numerical data, number of questionnaires, you're looking at, essentially a number of, say, surveys and polls that you've done. What you're looking at doing is basically using techniques like regression analysis, ANOVA. You're looking at using softwares like, Qualmetrics or SPSS to be able to, collate and interpret the data, because the data tends to be in huge numbers. So, for example, when the COVID vaccine was put to test, there were 30,000 volunteers and which were, administered this vaccine during the trials. Now, analyzing data from 30,000 individuals is a mammoth exercise. What kind of symptoms each individual will have, whether they'll have a fever, mild symptoms, major symptoms, whether they'll experience, breathlessness, high blood pressure, whether there'll be some sort of changes that they will exhibit in their body externally, internally. All those things will have to be measured. So quantitative method tends to, they tend to gather data because it's going to be numerical, statistical. You will need softwares, or essentially large amounts of data is going to be analyzed. And that is where you are going to be looking at using, mathematical theories, and in some cases, softwares and statistical techniques, as we call, to be able to use them to help you narrow down on some of the data points or conclusions from that data. Now, in the data which is collected, you're then going to look at reporting it systematically, collating it first. Then after that, you're going to report it, and then you're going to try and see the emergence of trends, which is going to help you define that these are the outcomes which are emerging from the research that you've carried out. Now, at this stage, you're also going to be looking at analyzing the review of literature that you've done, and that review of literature is also going to be used to compare some of the findings that you have found while collating the data from your research. So in this case, all the data which is collected is then used or analyzed using statistical softwares. In some cases, it is then once the analysis with the software is complete, that means the data has been meaningfully condensed. Then when it is meaningfully condensed, it would mean it will give you an output like data graphs, tables, or some sort of trends which will emerge, and they will then be triangulated for drawing out interpretations or conclusions, and they will come by comparing it with your literature review. They will come with by comparing it with your aims and objectives which are set, and the key data points and trends which are emerging from the analysis, collation, compilation, and the compilation of your data, which is basically nothing but results of questionnaires, polls, interviews, case studies, everything being analyzed or crunched to come out with numerical data. This then can be easily compared and interpreted to the aims and objectives set and some of the data which is already present in the published domain when you have carried out the literature review. And this would help you then understand what was originally set out when we looked at starting the research, and then what you have uncovered with the series of activities that you've carried out in terms of research to uncover some of the new data points or results which have come out of the activities that you have undertaken. So any questions on this? I know it's a bit abstract because we are looking at this theoretically from a point of view of the learning outcome. But obviously, when you do the research at some stage, some of these findings which come out after you've crunched the data using some of the statistical softwares or techniques like regression analysis or ANOVA analysis, or for example, in some cases, you use the software like Qualmetrics or SPSS. It helps you reduce the number of data. It helps you crunch basically the data that you've collected into a smaller number of data points, which then can be used for drawing out meaningful interpretations from the activities that you've carried out during the research. Now, the last assessment criteria tends to be looking at making recommendations and justifying the areas of research for future consideration. Now, here, when you say you've concluded your research, you're going to be then looking at putting together some conclusions in terms of recommendation, that this is what I would recommend needs to be done, or this is what I would suggest needs to be done. And that would essentially be looking at, the recommendations that you're making on the basis of data and outcome which has come out from your result. Now, when we look at the recommendations, they will need to help be made in context of that it will help improve the outcome of the study. Also, if there is a follow-up research or a follow-up series of activities which is to be done to carry forward this particular research or study, then in this case, carrying out these steps or prioritizing these particular areas of, let's say, investigation would uncover meaningful outcomes for the research. Now, sometimes when you look at the literal definition of the word recommendation, you also look at making suggestions, or you also look at helping in drafting suggestions which are going to be forming, let's say, the basis of the research proposal which somebody could draft for carrying out a research in the future. Or say, for example, that could mean that you could put forward a way, let's say you could put forward a way, in your research report, which could be a key direction for somebody looking at taking up research in the future. And that would be the follow-up course of action that you are recommending somebody else takes if they are to look at taking this particular project further. Now, assuming, as you can see, there are lots of different variants of COVID which are being discovered across the globe. There's a South African variant, there's an Indian variant, there is a South Asian variant, there's a Chinese variant. Now, if vaccines have to be modified and they have to be useful for the population in a particular area, in a particular geography, then there is important bits of research which needs to be done in order to tailor the vaccine to meet that requirement of overcoming the regional variant of the virus. So in this case, some of the recommendations that you're going to make, assuming when the trials were done and the research reports were compiled, and some of these companies looked at making recommendations that, okay, if the future version of the vaccine is to be developed, it will need to take into account the regional variants, and the regional variants would be the reports and the data would come in from the regions, which would clearly give us an analysis of how the variation is basically genetically mutating, and then is the vaccine protein or the formula of the vaccine, is it still, effective against that variant or not? Now, in those cases, you're going to be looking at making recommendations to say that if the vaccine has to be modified in the future to deal with various variants, then these could be the areas in terms of how the protein in the vaccine, the inactive protein in the vaccine, needs to be modified in order to make the vaccine effective against that regional variant. And they would be the kind of recommendations that you would generally look at making, or that would be generally published in the article or the report which these companies have published at some stage when they have come out with the COVID vaccine. So if we look at an example, if I try and show you an example of a research report and see these assessment criteria, essentially being put into practice from a point of view of what we've discussed, let's try and see if I can download a particular research report and then show you that how this would essentially be related to the three broad areas that we've covered in terms of evaluation techniques, in terms of interpretation and analysis of the result, and then towards the end, the recommended, recommendations and the findings, justifying future areas of research which can be undertaken, primarily for the purposes of carrying forward that research. So let's look at giving you an idea. Let me share the screen, which is, the link that I have mentioned earlier, from a point of view of, the research reports that you can access from Healthcare Foundation. So if I go into research projects, just as an example, so let me go into, let me start off with the research. As you can see, there are different research reports which are published chronologically. And if I just put out, say, if I look at person-centered care, and in person-centered care, as you can see, there are lots of different reports which are there. What I want to be able to look at is primarily reports in which there is data and analysis which has been done. So if I click on any, say, one which is the area of my interest, analyzing quality of life for people with a learning disability and a personal possible outcome. And if I go into a bit more detail, this is the basis of the research. It was done by Royal Mencap Society. These are the overarching objectives, aims and objectives of the research. So it is aiming to develop a better understanding of lived experience to identify what caring elements create the best possible quality of life for people with learning disability. Now, they have used the personal outcome scale as a measure of quality of life to basically carry out this research. Now, this research used 5,000 participants, and they have gone about conducting 5,000 interviews to finalize the findings of this particular report. Now, if I have to read into this research report and I have to look at some of the research findings, I click on the analysis and data. And then what I would do is basically go into the project and then look at clicking on the analytics and data of the research. And that would, if you see, provide me details of how this research was essentially carried out. So if I just go back in a minute, 1 second. So if I look at this now as the details in terms of how this will be carried out, I would then get all the details in terms of how the research was carried out, what were the clear data points which were collected, and then essentially it will help me understand the details of the various bases of how the research essentially was carried out, and why these conclusions have been drawn. Now, if I look at just for 1 minute, show you, say, for example, a different kind of a research report, just to relate it to the aspect of what we are discussing here. Maybe give it a bit more, let me put it this way, a bit more context to how we are looking at research. So if I just look at showing you an example. So let me just switch you over. Now, this, if you see, is a particular example of a research project, and the aim of the project was to study the impact of the Kyoto Protocol on the international business model. Now, it is taken a case study of an electric vehicle in India. And obviously, in order to study this particular research, the overarching title of the research is to study the impact of Kyoto Protocol on the international business model. Now, Kyoto Protocol essentially was, we've had the Paris Agreement, and now we've had the, agreement in Sharm el-Sheikh for the reduction of 1.5 degree, reduction in temperature in order to conserve, and stop the rise of, ocean sea levels and in the oceans. What we have looked at is this was the meeting which was held in Japan. And then in the 1990s, in the early 2000s, when this meeting had happened, this was termed as the Kyoto Protocol. So just that background. Now, if you see how the research has been compiled, first, it has gone into the background of what is Kyoto Protocol, what is emerging nations, why reduction in the carbon emission needs to be done, or control of greenhouse gases needs to be done in order to limit the rise of global temperatures to 1.5 degree. Now, it has been covered by the learner in the aspect of doing this from a point of view of looking at the first part of the chapter of your research specification, which is the background. Then in that, he has also discussed about the rationale of study. What is the research issue? Why is it that, this is of but this is a burning topic, and why is it of interest when we talk about essentially reducing carbon emissions? Why? What is the issue? Why is it now that this needs to be considered? And then what could be the aims and objectives of the research that he is looking at carrying out? So he's identified things like dimensions of Kyoto Protocol, how synergy, how to access and see there's a synergy between, some of the greater organizations which can help restrict the emission of carbons by adopting better technology or helping the emerging nations adopt better technology. And then towards the end, as you can see, it makes recommendations for sustainable international business development. So if you see the assessment criteria that we've discussed today, talks about evaluating appropriate techniques, interpretation and analysis of data, and then recommendation. So research questions, ethical issues and limitations, existing literature review, which is existing data has been analyzed. They've considered certain, key points or factors like the emergence of global carbon market, carbon emissions being offset, by developing countries investing in developed countries investing in developing countries. Now, what are the theories of international business model? And then in particular, because it talks about the case study of electric vehicle in India, it has also taken it into account as a parameter and discussed this in the review of literature that if an emerging economy like India is to invest into electric vehicles, it will also lead to the creation of 100 million jobs over a period of 30 years, 10 million jobs over a period of 30 years. Now, in this case, it is also looked at developing a research methodology, which is chapter 3 or third part. And then towards the end, the learner would have also given us a timeline or a Gantt chart to say how he would go about carrying out this research once it has been approved as per the research specification, time that will be spent on gathering data, interpreting data, and then finally presenting the conclusions and recommendations of the research report is going to be compiled. So this is how you would go about downloading a particular report, from, let's say from the site which I mentioned. And once you have downloaded the report, you're then going to be looking at, essentially analyzing, and interpreting the data. And that would then be presented, for the purposes of, completing the research project. So this is what I hope, gives you a broader understanding of the learning outcome 3 that we've discussed today. And if you have any questions at any given stage, do let me know. And what I would do is I would also be looking at helping you go through, putting across, a handout, which would essentially help you go through, this particular learning outcome in detail. And that could be an additional reading that you do essentially for the purposes of, crystallizing and broadening your understanding on what we've discussed today in terms of how to look at evaluating the research outcomes. So thank you for joining the session today. And I hope if there are any questions, I'll be more than happy to take it now. And the copy of this presentation and a subsequent handout on Learning Outcome 3 are also going to be available on Moodle shortly, along with the copy of the presentation being posted on the YouTube channel. So thanks so much for joining, and I'll see you tomorrow to cover the 4th learning outcome, which is primarily looking at presenting the research outcomes and how do we look at then structuring the report that is going to be evidence of the research activities that you have carried out for a particular topic or a topic of your interest. So thanks so much for joining, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye for now.